Well, welcome to another episode of Blazing, Grazing, and Other Wild Things. We're here today to talk about the New World screwworm issue that's recently been seeing some headlines about. We've invited Jonathan Cammack to be here with us today. He's the Extension Livestock Entomologist for the state of Oklahoma. So thank you for being here.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so, New World screwworm, it must be relatively new because the word new is in the name, right?
Right, that's a question that I've been getting for a few months now. It's like, why is it new? Didn't we have this before? And it's, yes, we did have it before. It's not new, it's New World, and that really comes down to the portion of the planet that we're talking about, where it occurs. So this one occurs in what would traditionally be called the New World, or North America and South America, and then there is another species that is has a very similar behavior that is Old World, so it's present in Africa and kind of the eastern hemisphere, if you will.
Yeah, so folks probably have been hearing about this recently. It's been making headlines, especially in this area. From your perspective, kind of what's changed with it? Obviously, it's been here a while. Maybe talk a little bit about the history of screwworm and why that we're starting to hear more about it again.
Sure, yeah, so it's not something that's new, it's a problem that is coming back. So this was an issue that a lot of the country dealt with up until about 1960 or so. We had populations that would occur throughout a lot of the Great Plains, most of the southern states during the warmer portions of the year. As it would start to warm up, they would migrate north. The fly would, laying eggs on wounded animals as it moved. Those larvae would develop on that animal tissue, drop off into the soil to pupate, emerge as adults, and then they just kind of, hopscotch like that, if you will, further north as temperatures warm up. So usually we would have them in the entire state of Oklahoma prior to that eradication period. And then when temperatures start to cool back down in the fall, those populations would get pushed back further south, usually to kind of southern California, southern Arizona, New Mexico, southern Texas, and Florida. And then in the spring, as the temperatures would warm up, they would start that progression again. Now, starting in the late 1950s, USDA had a program to eradicate this pest because of the problems it was causing with livestock and wildlife and basically any animal that it could, land on and lay some eggs on. And that program worked really well. And as that program was successful and pushed the species further and further south, we had areas that were declared screwworm free, and then in Panama is where the species has been kind of kept for about 20, 25, maybe 30 years or so at this point, and that was kind of the permanent quarantine zone for the pest. Now, starting in 2022, we had populations that occurred a little bit further north in Central America, and since that time, it's just been moving further north. It is now kind of in central Mexico.
Yeah, how many miles from the border is it now, roughly?
300-ish. We're looking at about 900 miles south of the Red River, so it's still a good ways before it makes it to Oklahoma.
And so can you talk a little bit about how they eliminated or kept it further south?
Sure. So it was a project that some USDA scientists, or a program that some USDA scientists started. They figured out that they could use low doses of radiation to actually sterilize these flies. So at a certain point in their development, when they're in their pupal stage, or if you think about like a butterfly or a moth, that's that kind of cocoon stage where they're transforming from that larval stage to the adult stage. If they get exposed to a low dose of radiation at a certain point during that development, it effectively makes them sterile. And so they can raise them, sterilize them, and then they get released out into the environment. And the thought is, or the idea, how this works is that you overload the environment with these sterilized male flies. They mate with the wild female flies, and then those wild female flies are laying eggs that are not going to hatch. And so that's the whole premise that this program was based on. And so at the northern range of the species, they were dropping out little cardboard boxes of sterilized fly pupae out of airplanes. They would hit the ground, break open, then the flies come out, and then they mate with those wild female flies, and so they continually release those sterilized flies in kind of a grid pattern further and further south as they were able to continually push that population south. And it worked out well, kind of getting them pushed down to the Darien Gap in Panama. That's basically the skinniest part of where North America and South America come together. So there's a very narrow stretch of land in which they could focus those efforts to try to contain them.
And so were they continuing to release those sterile flies this whole time, or was there a gap in it, or what? I guess.
Yeah, it's been a continual program. So initially there was a sterile screwworm facility in southern Texas when the program started, and that's what was kind of handling all the populations in the U.S. And then as the populations were pushed further south, there was a plant in Mexico that was opened up. And then as they continued to push them further south, the Texas plant closed, and then the Mexico plant eventually closed because that Panama plant was basically in the prime location to be able to keep the program functioning and keep the problem held kind of at that skinny part of the where Panama is at.
Okay.
So what's happened? Did just stuff get around that and then just continually has been populating north?
Yeah, we don't really know, unfortunately. There's a lot of speculation. So in Panama, essentially every livestock animal that gets moved, whether it's commercially or a person moving a single cow in a trailer, gets inspected. Somebody checks them to make sure that there are not screwworms present on that animal so that they can get moved. So my best guess is that there were probably some animals that were moved, probably without being inspected, so probably illegal movement, and we just ended up with some infected animals getting outside that quarantine zone. And since they weren't inspected, and if you don't know where to look for a problem, you're not going to see it until something kind of explodes.
Since that problem's probably been gone for a while, people don't even think about it, and then then once it's out there, and it's like, we're in trouble now.
Well, hopefully people in Central America would have been a little more vigilant about it, because they've had experience with it a lot less recently than we have. The last time screwworms were in Oklahoma was in the mid to late 70s, so we have very few cattle producers that are still around that remember that time of and the problems that we had.
Yeah, I remember growing up talking to some older folks, especially in the 50s, talking about having to, anytime they work cattle, castrate and make steers and stuff, they'd have to go out and check, because again, if I make sure I'm right, but screwworms do infect open wounds is what they're looking for, some kind of open wound, no matter what the cause, and some of that can be through animal husbandry practices that we do. And I remember there was a black, it was like a tarish paste. I remember some of the guys called like Smear 54.
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that they'd have to go rope, tie them down, and then smear that on the open wound to keep the screwworms from infecting them and stuff.
Yeah, and also put it on the navels of the newborn calves try to protect them.
All that.
I couldn't imagine having to go out, every morning during calving season to look for them and do that.
Yeah, and they talked about getting it on them, and it said it wouldn't come off. And stuff.
So what? Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, but is it true that their ivermectin is effective for screwworms, or possibly?
So I don't think ivermectin is as effective as it might be kind of made out to right now. So avermectin is certainly more effective than ivermectin is, but some of those kind of earlier or older chemistries of these macrocyclic lactones aren't as effective as some of the newer ones, and it really comes down to how much of this product is actually getting into the tissue where those larvae are feeding. So if an animal gets a shot of ivermectin or some other Dectomax or something, it's going to spread throughout their body to some extent. Now, is it going to get to that muscle tissue where they got snagged on the barbed wire fence, or or not? And that's kind of the big question that we don't really know. So if they happen to feed maybe on the pure compound, it's probably going to have some sort of an impact on them. But as they get further and further away from either the date of administration or as further out, like away from the kind of the edges of the animal's body where there might be low concentrations of that product, they're probably not getting a lethal dose.
Okay.
So you kind of mentioned the life cycle a little bit, but I think we'd be remiss not talk about what does it actually look like on the animal, because this is, I think, part of why screwworm gets such a bad rap, and people are really nervous about it because it's not one that kills animals in a very clean way.
Right. Yeah. It's not pretty at all. Really we're thinking about kind of open wounds on animals, whether that be natural openings from kind of their navels at birth, or maybe a cow gets snagged on some barbed wire or something is even as small as a tick bite. If that wound, however big or small it is, gets infected with bacteria, it's going to start to decompose a little bit, and those bacteria are going to produce some smells that we might not be able to pick up on, but other things in the environment like screwworms that have evolved to do this certainly can. So they're going to pick up on those smells, and then they're going to land next to that wound site and lay a clutch of eggs. Could be 100, 200 or so. Those eggs are going to hatch, and those really tiny larvae or maggots are going to feed on kind of that necrotic tissue around that open wound site. But then they're going to kind of switch from feeding on that necrotic tissue to also feeding on living tissue, and that's where we really start to see the problem with this. Is they'll kind of burrow down into the tissue, feed on what was at one point healthy tissue, and then just really start to consume the kind of muscle tissue, flesh, skin, whatever of those animals, and they can consume a pretty considerable amount of tissue. So I mean, I know we don't have pictures and stuff in front of us right now, but there's some terrifying photos from back when this was a huge problem in the U.S. of cows with half of their face missing and basically just covered in maggots, and it can be pretty bad.
Yeah, not stuff you want to look at over lunch.
Yeah, no, definitely on that. And so, yeah, that impact. So what is going into right now? Are they talking about reopening some of those plants, or?
Yeah, so there's a plant in Mexico that produces sterile fruit flies for protecting some of the other kind of crop-based agricultural production in Mexico and Central America, and they're kind of retrofitting some of that space so that they can start to raise screwworms there as well. But I think the timeline on completion for that might be late 2026, maybe sometime 2027. So we're not talking it's going to happen tomorrow. And then there's also an air base in South Texas that's going to be retrofitted to serve as a distribution facility for northern Mexico and the southern part of the United States if it does in fact make it here. So they'll mass produce the flies in Panama, and then in Mexico. Then they'll package them up, ship them to Texas, really quickly, and then package them up into the kind of drop zones, and then they'll send the planes out from there.
Yeah, I remember I've seen some of the old boxes. They were little white boxes with red bullseyes, circles, rings on them, and.
Yeah, now they're a little cardboard box that's about that big. It's maybe 6 by 8 inches or so, and about 2 inches thick, and it's brown cardboard with the bullseye on it as well. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting with screwworm is, obviously a lot of the talk and focus is on the livestock implications, which from an economic perspective, I mean, that's really super important. But, the wildlife implications are crazy, because the last time we had screwworm in the U.S. was actually in Florida with key deer, and it wasn't good.
Yeah.
Like in 5 months, it was over 10% of the deer died in 5 months of it being down there. And so I was reading some of the reports from like the 50s and 60s whenever screwworm, people were starting to address some of the problems with screwworm in the South. And there were some years that like 80% of the fawn crop would be killed by screwworm. And so deer populations, I mean, a lot of deer population increase during that time frame, we can attribute to more selective harvest pressure and things like that. But there's at least some case to be made that controlling screwworm definitely helped deer populations rebound following that, over harvest in the earlier part of the century. So it makes me nervous from a wildlife perspective.
Definitely.
On the screwworms, what is their host? Are they I mean, do they go to birds as well, or does it have to be?
So it's mainly mammals. There have been a few, isolated, cases of, other animals, birds, probably some reptiles, but for the most part, it's going to be mammals. So, nothing is safe basically. The scientific name is Cochleomia omnivorax, and omnivorax means man-eater if we translate that from, Latin. So, people, cows, cats, dogs, goats. I mean, really, any mammalian species is, could be potentially impacted by them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I know the livestock industry is gearing up and doing that, and bracing for that. But like you said, the wildlife folks are going to have to be big concern with that too, and be right in there with it, because. Like you said, those are some pretty serious statistics you talked about with deer populations.
Well, and the weird one with the Florida case was, obviously it's the Keys, so it's, basically a tropical environment, so there's, I think, temperature there that they can live more year-round than could be in Oklahoma, for instance. But when that case hit the Keys, it actually started out in the fall. And the timeline of that was fall into, I think they eradicated them in February or so.
I think it was September to February or somewhere around there.
Yeah, so that obviously doesn't line up with when fawns are hitting the ground. So a lot of the mortality, at least historically, would have been fawns. In the Florida case, a lot of it was bucks that were damaging, hitting each other during fighting during the rut. So obviously that, could have some effect on the population. I mean, but it was super male heavy. The mortality, and so from a population perspective, that doesn't really matter that much. But if it had been during the summertime that it had hit, and it had killed, targeted more females as well as fawns, that could have been huge.
Yeah, that would be.
Yeah, and the Florida one's, a little. I think I don't want to say good that it happened there, but that was the perfect place for it to happen, because it's isolated, but also that population of deer, even though they're a protected, endangered species, they're basically like, house pets on that island. They just come up to the people, and, they get, fed and stuff. And so that's how people were able to notice it, is they saw, these massive wounds on their heads that were basically infested with the larvae of the screwworms, and were able to get it reported. So, luckily we had people that were in tune with those animals and were able to say, hey, Freddie over here's got this hole in the side of his head, and they were named, and it's kind of sad to see some of the reports of it, but
but that was a short period of time and a pretty large number of animals impacted within that. That's incredible.
So with just the sterile flies, they were able to get it under control in like 5 months.
But it was a huge response, right? I mean, they're dropping millions of flies on a weekly basis on a very specific kind of flight pattern, within that area, and they do surveillance and monitoring and trapping all throughout that time to make sure that program is working. But it was kind of an all hands on deck, from the kind of USDA response team that studies screwworms, and that's kind of the same situation that we've got going on right now.
And I know they did some work with rollers, putting I don't know if it's insecticide or they did some work with like the individual deer treatments to try to reduce mortality. So it could have been even worse than 10 or 15% dying if they hadn't done that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that I had read that they have they've closed all of the livestock, moving livestock from Mexico to the United States. But as this potentially comes into the U.S., it'll be interesting to see what they do as far as moving livestock, but also wildlife across state lines. Because I guess unless you're inspecting every one of them, you could have something, have animals carrying screwworms.
And I think that points to, a very kind of, a real scenario, right? Where we'll be able to hopefully monitor the livestock movement, but, deer don't care about the border between Texas and Oklahoma or, any other states. They're going to cross. And so it's really going to take a lot of people, wildlife enthusiasts, hunters, basically anybody that's outside looking at an animal to kind of participate in, this monitoring program to if they see something that looks out of place, I mean, definitely report it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's same with like CWD. Like, I mean, I think for a long time with deer moving. I mean, a lot of the problems come from live animal movement, but I think hunters can also play a part by just processing deer within the general area obviously follow state regs, but I think just in general, just process deer on the property or close to the property where you harvested it, and avoid, moving deer long distances, because it's just kind of asking for more problems.
Yeah.
So currently, right now, like I said, they're about 300 miles south of the U.S. border on that. Is there any speculation on, what's the advancement going to be, timelines?
Not that I've seen. I think I'm pretty far down on the list of people that get that information, if it's even known. But the most recent jump that occurred to this current location was a movement of about 200 to 300 miles within the span of a couple of weeks. So it really points to it was probably a movement of an animal uninspected or unregulated or something, rather than it being a natural movement. So as long as we can get everybody on board, with the seriousness of this problem, it should help slow that spread. But since there is a case, in that area, the likelihood that some of those larvae completed their development, dropped off that host, burrowed into the ground, and pupated is relatively high. So, between the point of origin for that animal and where it was detected, there could potentially, basically be a trail of breadcrumbs, if you will, of some pupae that could be developing in the environment. And that's really the kind of unfortunate thing that we're up against, is it's not a natural progression, because we keep seeing these huge jumps in it. So it's got to be human mediated transport to some extent.
Yep. What do the adult screwworm, do they have what kind of lifespan do they have? Is it?
So they're typically going to live 2 to 3 weeks in the environment. They're going to be impacted by all sorts of things, heat, rainfall, birds are preying on them, and lizards and all sorts of stuff. Their wings get beat up as they're flying through vegetation, so that could reduce their lifespan. But we're probably looking at maybe 2 to 3 weeks at kind of the most amount of time that an adult would be living in the environment.
And then you said they lay eggs in the soil.
They lay eggs on the host.
On the host, excuse me. Yep. But then they pupate.
Yep.
Once they fall off, then they'll pupate in the ground.
Yes.
Can they survive like an over cold winter, or
no? So we're looking at, and that's one of the main reasons why we would see those fluctuations in their population from south to kind of the central part of the United States during the summer, is they can't really survive at temperatures. Don't quote me on this one, and I know we're recording, but somewhere within the probably within the range of maybe like 40 to 50 degrees. So we're talking a pretty warm, but they are a tropical and subtropical species, so they're relatively they don't have very good cold hardiness. So that's one thing that we've got going to our advantage, is that winter is coming at some point, right?
You're right.
So are there strategies that folks can adopt with their livestock so that they're not potentially putting them at risk?
Yeah, in an ideal world, we would probably switch over to spring calving, so where calves are dropping in February, March, where they're not going to be out in the environment, kind of at that point when the flies are present. But we can't do that now, right? All of our cows are that are going to be our that are going to be reproducing for the year, they're probably have already done that. So in the absence of being able to have a drastic shift in our animal husbandry practices, it's really going to take people being really in tune with their animals, monitoring them on a regular basis. If you see animals that have scrapes because they got hung on a hay ring or the fence or something, make sure you treat that. Don't check them once a month. Once a month is going to be too infrequent now. And daily is probably a little too often, for a lot of livestock producers in the state. But we've got to come up with somewhere between those to where they're being checked on a regular basis. We're talking maybe 10 to 15 days at kind of the fast end for the development of those immature screwworms on that tissue. maybe 15 to 25 days as it starts to cool off. So, we kind of want to be looking at our animals at least once a week to make sure that we don't have any wounds that have become infected.
And so then what are you putting on that wound?
So there are some treatments that can be gotten by working with a veterinarian. I'm not a veterinarian, so I can't make those recommendations. But from an insecticide standpoint, there are only a handful of products, unfortunately, that are registered for use against them. We've got one organophosphate, a coumaphos-based product, and then all the rest of them are synthetic pyrethroids. And so these can be used to kill the adults and also have some impact on the larvae, but it's not something that we can just go out and spray on the cows and think we're going to get a summer's worth of coverage, right? If we're thinking about managing horn flies, for example, we use ear tags and sprays and things for that, and those products have a window within which they're effective. Most of the sprays and pour-ons, we're probably looking at a month. Ear tags, maybe 3 months, but these products, they break down from sun exposure and rain exposure. And what do cows do? Stand out in the sun and get rained on. So it's not like we're probably not actually going to get 30 days worth of coverage just by spraying the cows with a synthetic pyrethroid product or something.
Yeah, I know. And also just going into the pond.
Yeah.
They're always going into the pond, and I remember that was always one they talked about that definitely reduced the life of a lot of those ear tags and stuff, because again, they got to coat their body and they keep washing it off. So, but hopefully, I guess we could keep that at bay south of the border, south of the U.S. border, and push it back down again.
Yeah, I think that's what everybody's hoping for.
Yeah, sounds like it's going to be a all-out international cooperation to get that back. I mean, that's what it was to begin with.
USDA and a portion of the Panamanian government have been working on that facility in Panama for the entire time it's been in existence. So it's always been a collaborative project. I've got a good friend who was a grad student when I was a postdoc that's one of the entomologists that's at the facility in Panama. So they kind of rotate on like a 2 or 3 year cycle, and she went down I think a year or two ago, so kind of right in the middle of the mix at this point.
Wow.
Yeah, so obviously we've been talking about movement to the north. What's going on south of Panama? Like, are they just dealing with screwworms all the time?
Yeah, just dealing with them basically year round, particularly in kind of the northern part of South America where it stays warm for most of the year. So it's it's an issue that they've continued to deal with, and they do have some additional insecticide products available in other countries that we no longer have available in the U.S. That might be a little more effective. So, they've probably got a few more tools in their toolbox, to kind of combat this problem. And I know there's talk, kind of from a regulatory standpoint, to try to get some of those products. Get an emergency use exemptions or labels for being able to use those products in the U.S. again. But, I don't know how long that's going to take. So it's certainly an issue that was kind of pushed down, to Panama, so that they could kind of hold it, at bay and then continue to, push the problem south, because, it's a huge issue for all animals, right? So, it's a program that's been in the works for about 75 years at this point to kind of eradicate this pest from the planet, and we've just kind of hit a snag at this point.
Man, well.
So, speaking of that, but are there any other parasites, insects and stuff that are also on the radar, or things that are maybe a concern that's going on around the state of Oklahoma or Southern Great Plains that we've got?
Yeah, so July 31st of 2024 was the first reported case of Asian longhorn ticks occurring in Oklahoma, and that was in the northeast part of the state. So that's a pest that was introduced to New England area of the United States sometime around 2010. It has been since moving south and west across the country. In central Oklahoma is about the kind of western edge of the predicted range, because if we think about anywhere basically west of I-35, it's going to be a little too dry and a little too hot for this kind of subtropical tick species to be able to survive. But definitely the eastern part of the state and northeastern corner in particular, there is a new tick species that's been in the state for about a year at this point.
So does it bring anything different with it than or other ticks, or what? I mean, what is the major concern about it?
Yeah, that's a lot of them, and probably one that we could do another episode of, of this on its own. But there is a pathogen that this tick species is a vector of that's pretty bad for cattle. Luckily, we don't have that pathogen present yet in Oklahoma, but we've got the tick. Arkansas, Missouri, and Kansas have the pathogen, so it's only a matter of time before the pathogen makes it here, now that the tick population's already here. So we've got a pathogen issue. Most of the populations of this tick are parthenogenetic, so they are 99 to 100% female. They don't need a male to successfully reproduce, so they don't have that added challenge in the environment of locating a mate to be able to lay eggs that are going to hatch. They can occur in very, very high numbers on animals. So typically when we think about most of our ticks, like Lone Star ticks, they're three-host ticks. So usually we see those younger life stages of the ticks on smaller animals, whether that's rodents or dogs and maybe some of our smaller wildlife. And then the adults, we would see them on our larger animals like cattle and deer. With the Asian longhorn ticks, they are three-host ticks, but we can see all three of their life stages occurring on the same host individual or host species. So we don't kind of see that separation of that host animal size with them like we typically see with Lone Stars and some of our other native species.
So are they a large tick, or
they're tiny? They're
really
maybe 3 to 5 millimeters or so, full grown adults.
So compare that with like a Lone Star tick,
about half the size of an adult Lone Star.
Wow.
Yeah, so if you think about those nymphal Lone Stars that we get into late spring, early summer, that's about the size of an adult Asian longhorn tick.
Like a seed tick.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah.
Wow.
Sounds like we need to set the northeast corner of Oklahoma on fire.
Yeah, we need to do some of that work, kind of like that.
We can't do much about screwworm, but we can probably do something about the ticks.
Yeah.
Man.
We can. Is there any other?
No, luckily, right? Those are the two that we've got right now. We've got one coming from the northeast and one coming from the south. So
well, we need something from the west.
Yeah.
So get something coming that way. So that's that's just pretty incredible to especially like with the screwworm, the work that has been done on that and all that's been in place. It's kind of one of those, seems like it's one of those deals that you think you got it whooped and you get pretty complacent with it for a while, and then all of a sudden there it goes. And
and I don't even know if it was complacency, right? I mean, it's been a very effective program for almost 75 years at this point, and with the exception of a few introductions like the one in Florida that Mark mentioned earlier, but it's been relatively few and far between.
Right. Yeah, it worked really great, but then like I said, they've shut down places. It's been so effective that don't do it, and then now all of a sudden, we're in trouble. We got to gear back up and do this. So I remember hearing over the past 20 years, there's always been a little bit of fluctuation where there'll be a few outbreaks you'll hear about coming up, up north of Guatemala into Mexico and some of that, but they'll sound like they'll hit them, and they're kind of isolated. But this one, I think, is kind of definitely got a broader stroke on the.
Yeah, when you look at the distribution maps that get put out on a weekly basis, this one has been a very steady movement. Across Central America and into Mexico. It's not those isolated jumps, that we see that get responded to, get taken care of. This has been a, kind of a continual, movement northward.
Yeah, so a lot more difficult to contend with because you're not sitting isolated outbreaks that are pretty easy. You could, surround them with irradiated insects and more flies and do that. And this is a broader front.
Yep.
So on that, well, that's very good. If anybody, is there websites, anything that people can go to keep up with the screwworm, and that might show that?
Yeah, so I have a page that I put together on my program website. So it's livestockbugs.okstate.edu. And right on that homepage, about halfway down, there's a button that says New World Screwworm information or resources, one of the two. But you can click on that, and it'll take you to links to where all of the USDA pages are that are being updated on a frequent basis. And I'm also updating that site as we have new information that comes out. So you can go there and get direct access to any of those kind of resources that are put out by USDA, and also the kind of joint information that occurs between the U.S., Mexico, and Panama.
Okay.
Awesome.
And there's also some information on the Asian tick.
Yep, Asian longhorn tick there as well. Yep.
Yeah, on that. So I know you've been doing that. So there's always also a lot of good information from the entomology fact sheets that are out through the extension.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, John. Have you used iNaturalist for identification? I'm sure you already know what they look like, but I'm just thinking about for folks that maybe they're like, well, I found this tick, but I don't know what it is. Have you ever? Is it good?
So I mean, I know that there's a. I've never uploaded a picture of an Asian longhorn tick to iNaturalist, but I'm sure that with the number of cases and the spread of that population, they're basically covering the eastern part of the United States at this point. So there's probably a very large number of images that have been in there. Yeah. But unfortunately, we have some other very similar species. They're within that same genus that if even to me, if I just look at it, I mean, I'd have to put it under a microscope and look at it with a key just to make sure that it's not one of our native species.
Okay.
Well, anything else before we wrap up?
No, sounds like we need to get ready to battle.
Oh, goodness.
And hopefully they can get it shut down at the border.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, we'll obviously be updating folks as start hearing more. And thanks again for having us, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you.
You bet.